Brian and Joey, are we good to go live? Great. I would now like to call to order the March 9th, 2022 meeting of the State Board of Education. Roll call, please.
Mr. Bess.
Here.
Ms. DeLosa.
Here.
Thank you. Mr. Durham.
Present.
Dr. Ernest.
Present.
Dr. Freitas. Mr. Gastineau.
Here.
Mr. Mapes. Ms. Moat.
Here.
Ms. Renschler.
Here.
Thank you. Mr. Watts. Mr. Watts. Dr. Jenner.
Here.
We have
Let's
quorum.
please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Chad, are we good to go on quorum for votes? All right, super. Is there a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Second.
With a motion and a second, any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Is there a motion to approve the minutes from February 9th, 2022 meeting?
Move to approve the minutes from the February 9th, 2022 meeting.
Second.
Motion, second. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. So a few things, probably the first thing on many of our radars, which is probably why our in-person audience is a little light today, is last night in the wee hours of the morning, nearing 1 a.m., our General Assembly said the magic words, sine die, which we all know concludes the short session. So the next major session will be, of course, in January, where we'll have a long session, a budget session. But we appreciate the partnership and work of our General Assembly members, both Democrats and Republicans. We're very much reaching out, asking questions about implications, asking questions, seeking data, asking questions about, how to make Indiana's education better. And we greatly appreciate that. We also persevered through January and February. I don't know about you, but I've talked to a lot of different people that describe those as kind of rough months on people individually, which obviously carries always into our workplace. So we are so grateful as a board for our educators and our schools and all they're doing actively. If you remember, feels like it was long ago, we had the Omicron variant hit us right when we came back to school. We were able to keep the vast majority of schools in person and actively learning. So huge congratulations there. And then also in early February, we had a snow ice storm that, and snow ice storms, are typical in Indiana, but we had one that impacted the entire state of Indiana. And so again, we persevered through that. And I know on the top of minds, additionally, is obviously what's happening overseas in Ukraine and Russia. So certainly our thoughts and prayers are with the Ukrainians. I also wanted to brief you. I believe it was yesterday we released a press release on Crossing the Finish Line initiative. And that's something that we, as a team, based on listening and need, we started last year, noting that educational attainment is incredibly important for our individual students, for local communities in the state because of economic development. We partnered with the Commission for Higher Ed State Board of Ed, DOE, and asked them, asked Vincennes and Ivy Tech, how many students are within 2 to 3 classes of completing a post-secondary credential. They pulled the data, and we had, just in the summer, after many of their senior year, 1,900 high school students participate in completing a credential focus. So free tuition, free books, et cetera. So 1,900 high school students participated from 275 Indiana high schools, all school types, saving families over $1.1 million in tuition fees, books, and other education expenses. I think many of those students, not all, but many of them did earn their post-secondary credential, and so we decided to launch again. Let's try it again. It was very successful. It helped a lot of students. So the number was just pulled, and it is over 16,000 students who are eligible this year to participate. We'll certainly be watching that data closely, and these 16,000 are either within 15 credits which is 5 courses from the Indiana College Core, or 9 credits within a CTE credential. So very exciting, and we will be watching. We've started to send out information to schools. I know that Ivy Tech and Vincennes will also be reaching out. And if you think about it, remember these credentials will also be able to transfer. So if they complete one credential, it's stackable into another. The other thing I want to point out is, in addition to watching that data, one of the specifics that we've talked about a lot as a board is down to student population. How many of our Black students, Latino students actually participated and earned a credential through this opportunity? Low-income students. We could go on. On that note, let's go ahead and move forward. I think I'll share more about the 2 presentations right before we present. Any other board member have comments or reports?
Can I ask a question about your comment? The 16,000 students that are eligible, and I think this is great. The 16,000 students that are eligible, clearly part of that is due to our last couple of years in the pandemic. How it seems to me this could really greatly impact even looking forward more when we look at graduation pathways and what students need and those kinds of things. If we were not in a pandemic, do you have any feel for what that 16,000 would look like?
Yeah, that's a good question. So you think about that number, and it's actually 16,712.
Okay.
I probably should have rounded up. But you think about that number of students in a cohort of, our culture typically 82, 85,000, that many students eligible, that close to a credential. Indiana has done an incredible job. Our schools have done an incredible job in scaling dual credit, dual enrollment, advanced placement opportunities for students. So we're sitting in a really, really good spot to take it, to flip it to that next level. So you asked about the impact of the pandemic. I would probably want to defer to our schools on some of that. The question is, gosh, would more students in a non-pandemic, would more students be eligible? Would we have a larger percentage of that cohort? Potentially. It definitely wouldn't be less, but it could be more. And that's something that's a data point that, and you all know this, when it comes to educational attainment as a state, in many all states are like this, we've focused big time on post-high school graduation and really, keep getting kids to continue training or recruiting adults back, next level jobs, et cetera. I think where we have a huge opportunity as a state is that 11th and 12th grade year. We've talked about this, right? Rethinking that time period so that students are as strategic and intentional as possible so that regardless of how life hits them when they graduate high school, they've had every shot we can give them to earn some credential of value before they leave. And again, I really attribute this to our schools, partnering with higher education institutions in Indiana, and listening to workforce needs. So probably, Byron, down the road, we'd expect that number to grow and more students become eligible for this opportunity. Good question.
Well, then I think that plays, sorry if I can add one more.
Yeah.
It adds to some of the other discussions that we've been having around some schools have really increased, which kind of shocks me at times, have increased in the number of waivers, right? For grad, and I think, and this directly applies to how that plays. So I think this all comes together for this
Yes.
story that we keep talking about, right? I think now
Yes.
you've got these data points that are starting to come together that give us some stories
Yeah.
to think about. And your mind went more minded. Does that increase, does that number increase without a pandemic, or does it decrease? I don't know, right?
Yeah.
And we would not know. We have no way of knowing.
Yeah.
But, I mean, we will in future years, right?
will.
So, but anyway, sorry, that was a great data point. Appreciate you bringing that up. It just caused
Yeah.
me to think about some
Yeah,
things.
you're welcome. So the other thing, just for the board to be reminded of, in December, when we passed Indiana Graduates Prepared to Succeed dashboard indicators, one of the high school indicators that we're targeting is to better understand credentials being earned at the high school level, by student population, so that we can be as strategic as possible. And again, it helps the student, it helps the community. So I wanted to share that update with you. Any other board questions, comments? All right, so we will move to public comment. We have one, Kendra Johnson.
Good morning.
Good
To
morning.
each and every one of you. One of my biggest concerns, and you mentioned about what our lawmakers were doing across the street. One of my biggest concerns that I would like to present to each and every one of you is the idea of keeping these meetings on YouTube and providing some sort of way for the families, the taxpayers, and most importantly, our students of the state of Indiana, informed on what goes on here and what you all do, to give them a chance to present their voices as public outreach, community outreach. And as some of you may know, I am a huge proponent of Title I law. Matter of fact, before I came here, I went on the website and I saw that you all were asking for public comment for the ESSA, the state plan. And many of the parents may not even know that this is being offered because they may not know about the website. The schools where their children go may not have told them that you all are asking for this because maybe they don't even know that you're asking for this. I called the radio station, WLTH in Gary, Indiana, before I came here to let parents know that this was on the website. Another idea, perhaps contacting the radio stations and trying to see about advertising with them to get feedback. And I say all this, I present all of this to say this is a form of transparency. That way, the families can see that you are opening the doors for them to be involved, that this is not a fortress department or a come when we call you, but a partnership, a true partnership, so that they can help their children get the education they deserve to prepare them for not competing in the country, but competing globally. Because now our children are no longer competing on a national level. It is now global. And if anything, COVID has taught us, it's how important technology is. Not just for corporations, but for each and every individual to stay in touch and to work together. Even though we may not be together physically, technology will help us be together in a way that had not been thought of previously. Thank you, and have a good day.
Thank you very much. And I tell you what, driving in this morning, Kendra, I thought you might be here. We frequently have conversations after these board meetings, and it gives an opportunity to just acknowledge, in order to best educate a child, in order to give a child as much opportunity as we can, it takes educators and parents working together as partners. And I can think of hours of meetings that we've spent in schools, that schools spend just today alone across Indiana, thinking about parent and family engagement. It is very important to us. We are eager to have parents at the table with us. And I appreciate your ideas and thoughts. As you know, Kendra, we're sitting in a room right now for our viewing audience of probably, I'd say 50 chairs, and about 12 are filled. We would love to have more people and would welcome that. You also know we have a video team that puts this out there live and is also recorded and posted to our website. The other thing that I would add that we will soon start sharing more information about is our Indiana Learning Lab, which was started actually as a local project. It was called E-Learning Lab right here in Marion County with philanthropies and Marion County school leaders. They started that, and it was started for educators to provide a portal of resources, information. That was then shared with the state of Indiana, shared with us so that we could go statewide with that resource. We have, it's skyrocketed in terms of people who have joined. We started this time last year. I think we had a couple thousand. We're up to over 17 or 18,000. But the one thing I wanted you to know is, again, back to that conversation, it takes educators leaning in, and we're there, we're ready to help. And it takes parents also willing to help. So we have a parent arm, a parent portal arm on the Indiana Learning Lab that is, again, specifically to support, as parents, support their children at home with learning, reading at night, working on numeracy skills, etc., having them do their assignments in preparation for the next day. We have that support arm now out there on Indiana Learning Lab. But I think there's no educator in the state of Indiana, I would dare them to call me or email me, that doesn't believe that we want parents right there with us helping their child. So it's a partnership, and as always, Kendra, I appreciate you being here and being a part of the solution. So on that note, let's move forward. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
So moved.
Second.
The motion and second, any discussion? No discussion, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Making sure. So now we will shift to a couple of discussion items. And the presentations are actually gonna blend together, so I'm just gonna go ahead and tee up both of them. We have an update on special education child count data. If you remember last meeting, Dr. Ernest asked about child count data, and so we're gonna give a little more information about that. Brandon Myers, who is our data specialist on our special education team, will give this update. And then we'll also have, I mentioned this last meeting, an update on some of our early literacy and STEM initiatives. that are designed to support our schools and educators. I will tell you that, and I've prepped the board, but I want the general public to know this. We have an RFP out, which means request for proposal. That was out, the application closed early mid-February, and we're now in the process of reviewing all of the applications that we've received. And so the people who are reviewing those have signed non-disclosure agreements, but we won't talk anything about vendor-specific. We only will talk about the high-level work forward. We wanted to make sure you had a very clear idea of some of the really cool opportunity we have ahead to support literacy in STEM, but again, also don't want to accidentally disqualify any potential applicants. Don't worry, we'll come back again and give you an update once that selection has been made. So on that note, and I should say that Lynn Schemmel, our Indiana Department of Ed Director of Assessments, and Carrie Polk Meek, our DOE Director of Teaching and Learning, will be presenting that data. So on that note, Brandon, take it away.
Okay, thanks. Good morning, everybody. So yes, as Dr. Jenner mentioned last month, you folks approved the child count, and we had a question from Dr. Ernest, so I met with him, with Dr. Holsapple, and we discussed some of the things that were going on, mainly in relation to developmental delay, but we also thought we'd briefly go over some of the trends that we've seen over the last few years on the child count. So that's what we're going to talk about briefly here today. And can we, who's advanced? Oh, thank you. Okay, so just to start out, this is the percentage of students that we have identified with disabilities out of the total enrollment of the state. It's been going up modestly but kind of steadily since the last 7 or 8 years. We did not see a big change in this number with COVID, so it's stayed pretty constant, but it's on a slight upward trajectory, and you'll see some of the reasons why it's going up a little bit as we go forward here. And we can go on to the next slide. This is the total adjusted pupil count. As you know, there's 2 different counts for the special education count. So the adjusted pupil is those students that are at kindergarten eligibility age for this year, and all the way up to age 22. So that's the obviously much larger count, and we had seen a growth that kind of mirrors some of that modest increase in percentage. It flattened out for the 1 year, the 2020-2021 school year with COVID, but we're starting to see it tick up again. I will say that the percentage did not go down because, as you know, our overall enrollment went down in that the big COVID year, 2020, 2021. So we weren't really surprised by anything we saw here. The share, though, of what, and this is what Dr. Ernest's question mainly was about, was that developmental delay was introduced to this count. So it used to be only a preschool disability. Once a child reached that kindergarten eligibility age, they either had to be evaluated into a different disability or evaluated out of special education services, and a lot of the students would come back later, particularly specific learning disability. So you see the yellow, this shows the share of that APC count, what makes up the distribution, and the yellow DD is obviously been the fastest growing one since 2018. So we were close to now 10,000, getting closer to 10,000 students in the developmental delay, whereas 5 years ago we had 0 in this count. So that's a dramatic growth. And we also have seen the adjacent disabilities decline, which is what we expected. So specific learning disability and speech and language impairment have gone down over that time, and a lot of those students are still in the DD. We also have obviously students who are staying in special education for a longer period, or they're not, or they're staying in for the whole time rather than being taken out and coming back in. The other big story on this, which is a very long-term story, is the increase in other health impairment. So that has been going up, and you see it's a little flattened since developmental delay, but it's still that's a big growth number every year in the other health impairment. So the developmental delay, I mentioned the big, large increase on that. Just to kind of expand on what that is, we can go to the definition, and it's there's either one or more of these categories, and if there's one, it's one standard deviation. If there's two, it's a different level. But it's one of these 5 categories of gross or fine motor development, cognitive development, receptive or expressive language, social, emotional development, or self-help. At the preschool ages, obviously this manifests itself differently than it does later, but we see a lot in receptive or expressive language development particularly, and the gross or fine motor development in preschool. The cognitive becomes clearer a little later, so the strategies for evaluation do change as the students get a little older. And obviously this was extended on the next slide in 2017, and it became effective July 1, 2018. So we've now had 4 years of this. We helped score at the time with the Legislative Services Agency because this is increasing our special education population, and developmental delay is funded at a higher rate than language and speech, at least. And so some of those kids that have moved, that are staying in that developmental delay category, we did do the scoring. And it's nothing that I don't think we anticipated, although it has stayed constant, that growth rate of about 2,500 a year. And it has also affected the preschool count. So the preschool count, once a child turns 3, he's eligible for special education services, and then until that kindergarten age is met. So even though this was already in place, we've seen changes here too, where LSI has gone down and developmental delay has gone up, because the developmental delay before, if you were identifying a child at 4.5, maybe they weren't being identified at developmental delay because they could only be that for half a year. But they are now, and so we've seen that increase. Between language and speech and developmental delay, you're looking at about 85% to 90% of all kids in the preschool. So that really dominates our preschool program. And the COVID effects, as I said, there was obviously an effect in the school-age population that we kind of expected and wasn't particularly dramatic given the decline in enrollment. But at the preschool level, we did see a much more dramatic story. Now, the scale on this is obviously much smaller because we're dealing with about 13,000 to 14,000 students rather than the 160 that we are with the APC count. But we saw a large decrease to our numbers going down below what they were in 2014 for our preschool population. That also mirrored the preschool population overall in the state. So the enrollment went way down in preschool much more than it did in anything else. So those early childhood kids are being seen at a significantly less high rate than they were before the pandemic. And you can see it's came back up this year, but it's still well below where we were, and I can talk about that if anybody has any questions on why that is the case, but that is something that we're watching because these are kids that are going to be coming in to the system who probably would have been identified and now will be identified 1 to 2 to even 3 years later than they would have. So that's going to have a long-term effect on those children's development because they missed out on those services during that time. And so when those students come back in, we think that a lot of those will be in developmental delay, so we'll probably see that increase continue. At some point, it's going to have to level off. So that's, as we monitor the count over the next couple of years, we'll have to see when that starts to level off and if COVID has any effects on that. And as I mentioned, the academic impact on those children that have not been receiving supports as they get into those elementary literacy years in particular, it's going to be dramatic, even more dramatic perhaps than some of our academic impact are at the school age population. So that is something that we're paying very close attention to and making sure that our evaluation numbers do go up over the next couple of years. So does anybody have any questions?
I have a question. Just out of curiosity, let me get to the page, I'm sorry. So for the share of total APC count for developmental delay, am I understanding correctly that category began in 2018? Did I hear that correctly?
Right, July 1, 2018, so December 1 was the first count of that.
Okay, so then my question then becomes, do you think that, or where were students who may have qualified to be in that category previously? Were they identified in other categories prior to 2018?
They probably weren't moved into developmental delay, but it's the population coming up that was kept in developmental delay from having been identified as preschool. So you had a 4 or 5 year old that wasn't yet kindergarten eligible. They're identified as developmental delay. They would have been under the old law reevaluated and either put into maybe language or speech or significant learning disability or mild intellectual disability, but they weren't because the DD was allowed to stay. So the reevaluation is not required. It's recommended every 3 years, but now that DD was available, they were delaying, a re-identification or identifying them out of special education altogether. And then the other part of that would be kids that were newly identified, maybe at 6 years old. Developmental delay wasn't available to them before, so they might have been found ineligible even, but now they're being found eligible.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Yeah, go ahead.
Brandon, first of all, and Katie as well, thank you for this, right? Because I think the power of a great board is asking questions to get, and I appreciate you telling the story, right? Because I think that, I know I'm big on that, but I think we should always be able to tell a story with our data and understand. The one question that I had, based on what you said today, if you back up, can whoever's doing
I can. I didn't realize this was on here.
Go forward.
This is.
One more. So our academic impact, I have two questions. Our academic impact, because of the lack of early interventions because of pandemic, do we feel like, this may be a you or whoever question, do we feel like with what we're doing with the early literacy and the things that we're going to hear about here in a minute, are we helping to mitigate those things too down into that, or are there other things that we need to be doing? Does that question make sense?
It does, and I'm looking at, it does, and it's a fantastic transition, too.
It's a bridge question.
Carrie, I think when you're up here, Carrie, certainly you dig into that a bit.
She's smiling, so it does.
It does. It totally does. Brandon, I don't know if you have anything to add or.
No, I mean, I think that's the larger, the kind of structural story that goes on with that. A lot of that's going to have to be done at the individual level of the IEPs for those children who are delayed. So looking at the present levels of those children as they come in later than they would have, right, if we hadn't had COVID, then at the individual level, those services are be customized for that. But I would say the literacy part, that will make it, that's the kind of thing that will be available to them.
Yeah, and I would
the
say
overall.
to add, so tactically, and we have 3 pillars: students, educators, system level. Underneath each of those, there are various strategies and then tactics underneath. So today we're going to hear about a series of tactics under literacy and STEM. We also have several tactics we're deploying in the early learning space. And that in pushing on quality, access to quality there. So looking at our early learning numbers, Brandon, that you pointed out and where we are. I mean, that's another tactic that should help. But I think like all good educators, you deploy tactics, you deploy strategies, and then you regroup and you determine what worked and what do we need to double down on. But again, I think we're gonna dig into a little bit the literacy and STEM piece here shortly. And yeah.
Perfect. Brandon, one last question. So we talked a lot about the changes in law and different things that came into effect 17, 18 in that route. And when we visited, we talked about how that had really helped to get students identified earlier and get them the services and those kinds of things. Do you think, I'm now asking a Brandon opinion based on what you've seen. Is that okay? Okay.
I don't know what you're gonna ask, so
Brandon
maybe.
opinion, or anyone else, is there anything else, because I think these are important questions to bring up too, right? Is there anything else that needs to be done to make it better? Whether that be from a law standpoint, from a whatever standpoint. I thought it was interesting when talking to Nancy and company that you said, hey, those things that went into effect and the way we identify and when really helped us get students identified earlier and get them the help. Is there anything else that comes to mind that needs to be done?
Well, I mean, schools' resources for evaluations are always under stress. So they're under, and that's maybe not a law change, but they're always under stress anyway. So they're on particular under stress now because we have this backlog, so to speak, of these students who were not seen as much or not referred for whatever reason during the last couple of years. So I think that is the biggest concern of making sure that the timelines and the identifications proceed. And then I think as we go on, we will be watching to see how this levels off and whether these kids are re-identified over time. So some of them may be dismissed from special education services altogether. When that exactly happens is, you should be reevaluating when it's necessary. But that is also related to resources. So I think that's the one thing that we're watching is to make sure that those kids are, when they're found to be a different category or additional things that could be more precise, its developmental delay is a little more general in its definition, that they're reevaluated. So that's the only part of that I can see from a structural point of view. Dr. Holsapple, you want to talk to her, she may have some other thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon, appreciate it. Carrie,
Thank you.
Lynn, if you want to come up.
Hello, thank you for having me today. I'm Carrie Polk-Meek, Director of Teaching and Learning. So it
Can
was
I
kind
pause you there?
Yeah.
Carrie is also Principal of the Year in Indiana. We hired her before we knew that. And now that we know that, we're even more proud of her. But I just wanted the board to, I should have said that in your introduction, Carrie.
Oh.
That's a really big deal.
Thank
So
you.
just wanted to point that out too. Keep going.
Thanks. Well, as Brandon was speaking, just had this moment. I was the principal in a pre-K 4 building, 98% free and reduced lunch, Wayne County, Indiana. And I was principal at the moment when the DD label was extended past into kindergarten from preschool. We had a preschool, obviously, so to hear that and then to hear Byron's question today about the plan for early literacy and then for STEM, it's kind of like I have to pinch myself a little bit to know that I'm right here at this moment with the experiences I've had. So I want to start just with kind of a broad overview of Indiana's priorities for early literacy and STEM. I know that you're very familiar with them, and of course I'm happy to answer any questions. And I'm in charge of the slides now. That is, and that worked. So now I have a system and we're going to be okay. That was a hurdle. Okay, so just very quickly, again, a broad overview, just a level set for the board today on the current literacy and STEM initiatives, how we're defining our priorities for early literacy and STEM implementation, and then some additional literacy-focused initiatives. Okay. And Brandon did a good job, and I know that Dr. Flores has presented relative to academic impact and iRead, and certainly I'm going to defer all of the really great in-depth conversations about assessment and iRead to Lynn today. But what we do know and what we have always known is that students that are poor readers at the end of 3rd grade continue to be poor readers throughout their academic lives. Last year, 2021, we had 81,000 3rd graders take iRead. And we had an 81% pass rate. But we want to dig a little bit deeper into that data, and then we want to make a connection with the science of reading and some of our early literacy initiatives. We know that Black and Hispanic students perform 15 to 20% lower, below grade level than their peers, based on the 2021 results. We know that special education students and English learners perform 15 to 30% below grade level peers. Each year, approximately 6,000 students receive a good cause exemption in the state of Indiana based on their ELL or special ed status. And we know from following them through iStep, through iLearn, that they are less likely to pass or to be at grade level throughout their entire academic career. Relative to our STEM initiative, the number of jobs in the computer and math sector are expected to grow by 7,000 in 2028. In 2019, over 60,000 undergraduate degrees were awarded. Less than 1/3 of them were STEM degrees. So we know and understand and appreciate that we have a need to develop STEM leaders and learners in the state of Indiana. Only 35% of Indiana students were proficient on iStep math, exam, and similar outcomes have occurred in iLearn. So we have identified data and an initiative to help address our deficits in that area. In 2019, about 28% of the STEM degrees were awarded to female students. Similarly, in the same year, only 5% of STEM degrees were awarded to Hispanic students. There has been a decrease in the number of traditional undergraduate students majoring in subjects that would lead them to STEM teaching credentials.
Real quick, Carrie,
Yeah.
on that, the 28% of the STEM degrees, that is specific to all STEM degrees?
All STEM
And
degrees.
that's at any level of the collegiate level, so
Any level.
associate, certificate, bachelor's, okay?
Yes.
And I just wondered, because then the second bullet is about the teaching credentials, so I just wanted to clarify. Thank you
Yeah,
for that.
absolutely. Okay, so we're going to dig a little bit first into Indiana's priorities for early literacy, and then our priorities for STEM will follow right after. The early literacy priorities are there, and they are around the science and the implementation of the science of reading throughout Indiana schools. That includes high-quality, data-driven development for educators, and it also includes an increase to access to quality literacy interventions, remediation, and enrichment for all students. So relative to Byron's question to Brandon before I started my presentation, there's the answer, and I'll delve a little bit more deeply relative to the science of reading and some of the key pieces and frameworks of the science of reading that support early learners to help them read and become more proficient and on level. STEM priorities, we want to refine STEM pedagogy with research-based best practices, develop STEM leaders and educators across the state of Indiana, and increase access to STEM courses, programs, and resources. We're going to start with a quick implementation explanation of the science of reading, the early literacy initiatives. And as Dr. Jenner mentioned prior to the presentation, we are in the process of procurement. So it will be a rather broad overview, a high-level overview of the process for you all. So we started by identifying a subset of high-need schools, up to 100 in the first year, 50 for literacy and 50 for STEM. Some schools were targeted or identified in advance and invited explicitly to join our efforts. And again, this is a coalition of the willing, so they were invited. And then in February, we released opt-in for both STEM and Lit and allowed for school districts, corporations, and schools to make the decision based on the initiatives and the professional development that we've been providing to apply. Corporations and districts, and I think I just mentioned that in the second bullet, they'll receive, whether they're opt-in or targeted, they're going to receive the same training, the same resources over the next 2 years. We'll bring in more schools and more districts in year 2 so that we can serve up to 200 different schools. Okay. A little bit about how we selected. Early literacy, when we defined it for our priorities, it is kindergarten to grade 2 in the first 2 years of the implementation. STEM is specifically focused on grades 4 to 8. We started with a regional focus, inviting engagement across the state of Indiana to make sure that we had participants from everywhere. Considerations included student populations that were most impacted by COVID, racially and ethnically diverse, low income, special education, English language learners, and based on the data that I shared and that Brandon shared, you understand why. Historic data was also used pre-pandemic to make sure that we were getting a good offering. So thinking about something that was mentioned in an earlier conversation, how do we know what would have happened without the pandemic? So we dug very deeply to pre-pandemic data as well, and used iLearn, good cause exemptions, and iLearn Math and Science for STEM. One of the things that we're most proud of relative to both the STEM and the literacy initiatives is coaching and how and why we're using the coaching model. So we know that research shows us that sometimes professional development, traditional professional development, it's a one-stop shop. You know, teachers have their heads filled for the day, they leave, and we hope, with all sincere intentions, that what they learned is implemented across the building and monitored and evaluated effectively. What we knew or began to understand when we looked closely at the coaching model data is that when we provide professional development at the school level, at the grade level, at individual levels, at regular intervals with the coach embedded in buildings to help with instruction, to help with best practices, that whatever they're implementing, whether it's the science of reading framework or STEM, can be sustained over time. And again, with a 2-year model, that allows us to embed coaches who are then training and facilitating teachers within buildings across the state. Next steps, coaching and recruitment, and we are deep in the weeds with this one for sure right now. Year 1, as I mentioned earlier, we are recruiting targeted and opt-in schools and vetting coaches and coaching candidates, and that I can say very sincerely is going very well. There's been a lot of excitement and a lot of enthusiasm in both the science of reading and STEM. Vendors, the vendor that will be selected in the future will provide training, ongoing support, and program evaluation, and that will begin in July with implementation planned for August of 2022. In year 2, we will continue the process of recruiting targeted and opt-in schools, continuing training, ongoing support, bringing in a new cohort of educators that will join the educators that have been involved in the first year, and continue to work with coaches in schools across the state. And then...
Can you pause there really quick?
Absolutely.
I want to put this a little bit in perspective for the board. And for educators, if you can visualize the MTSS triangle, multi-tiered systems of support triangle, where you have the very tip of the triangle is tier 3, usually around 5% of students are targeted. Tier 2 is usually around 20%. Tier 1 would be the bottom level, which is more all-inclusive. So this kind of goes back to some of the tactical deployment. When Carrie mentioned 200 schools, to put it in perspective, we have 1,051 elementary schools of all school types in Indiana. So, quick math, you're the math teacher. You're the math, I won't put you on the slide, don't worry. 200 out of 1,051 is about 19%. So we're targeting, so 200, I think, perspective, you're like, gosh, that doesn't seem like much, but that's 20% of our elementary schools who are specifically targeted to get additional support. And I don't know if you're gonna dig into this, Carrie, the tier 1 on the Learning Lab, the resources, are you gonna hit that in
I
here?
am.
Then I'm gonna stop. There's a tier 1 push as well, that for all schools to have access, that Carrie will hit on. But just wanted to put that in perspective for you.
Yeah. And I think there are lots of things that are, again, as somebody who just recently left the field, that are pretty brilliant and get me really excited about this plan. And one of them is the way in which the plan is working alongside teacher prep, pre-service entities to help implement and to engage in the science of reading. And so part of what we will be working on relative selecting the vendor is the way in which they will work with teacher prep programs so that the science of reading becomes a part of what our pre-service teachers are learning and the way that they're engaging with this framework. And then Dr. Jenner just mentioned this, and I will say that the Learning Lab it's an absolutely phenomenal source, and I've been really very lucky to be able to work with Diana and her team, and our specialists are just absolutely amazing. We worked with Dr. Kelly Williams, and she's from IU, and she had helped earlier to create the dyslexia toolkit that was created for the Indiana Department of Ed. And so she agreed to do our first science of reading professional development. And I like to joke, and Diana would just want to kill me, but I'm going to tell you, we broke the lab. We didn't really. But what happened is that we had so many people in that first science of reading training sign up, over 450. The Learning Lab was like, well, the way we were going to deliver this isn't going to work. So they had to change the format, and everything was great, and we had a huge turnout. And
We did not break the
did
lab
not break the
during
lab.
the training.
We did not
It was
break the lab.
before the-
Yeah,
Training
absolutely
went
not.
off
Absolutely
without a
not. Well, because, I mean, they were superlative and very responsive and took care of everything that needed to be taken care of. But we are currently in the throes of creating a leading and a leadership collaborative effort across academics that will allow for us, starting next month, to provide additional coaching, science of reading, interactive professional development sessions, STEM, integrated STEM approaches that will bring in individuals from, I dare say, across the nation who are willing to help participate in this. So we'll have the ability for people across the state to access information regarding science of reading and integrated STEM, even as this initiative is taking off in the state.
Quick question. Again, this is coming from a high school person, so
Yeah, that's,
please bear with me on
Yeah.
my ignorance with reading. But so targeting the 200, right? The schools that kind of collectively didn't get are struggling, right, with early literacy, which I think is phenomenal.
And 100 are literacy, 100 are STEM.
Okay,
I think,
Over 2
yeah,
years.
just to clarify, yeah.
so those are kind of our, not necessarily, I wouldn't call them low performing, but schools that are clearly having some struggles with early literacy. And I love the fact that you're really talking about the science of reading, because I think there's been a ton of research across the country that said, look, this is, there's a way to do this that's proven. But not all of our schools across our state use
that framework.
that framework, right? And so my concern, or my question, I guess, is all those schools out there who are not targeted because collectively their results are good enough not to have any danger signals. But inside those schools, there are students who are struggling with literacy for a variety of reasons, right? But because in that specific school, they're not using these methods, and it's voluntary, right? I mean, again, the Learning Lab is great, but it's voluntary, and if they could do it, not do it. My worry is we have a whole bunch of schools out there where the results are masked because there are so many students who just read well, right? For, again, whatever it is, about parent involvement, all those kind of things. They're reading to them at night, all those things, and they pick it up. And there's a subset of students who don't, but they're not getting the kind of quality early reading instruction that you're talking about, that we're gonna really target these schools. But then there are thousands of students in the state who struggle with literacy and will never catch up, right? But their schools are good enough that they don't have to do this. It doesn't highlight. And I'm sure that I've got a question here somewhere, but I guess, what are your thoughts around that? Because it's, there's a hammer approach that says we're gonna mandate that our teacher ed programs do this, because not all do, right? And we have big public universities in the state where the teacher prep programs vary widely. What are your thoughts around, kind of the hammer of the mandate versus more highly publicizing, like, the holes that we have across the state, and say, look, you need to serve all students, and you've got 15% of your student base that struggles with literacy. but relative to everybody else, you're great because 85% are on target.
Yeah.
I'll stop and just, what are your thoughts there?
That feels like more of a policy question than a, here's what I do know and understand, is that we have been completely overwhelmed by the response to science of reading. All other things constant after 25 years in public education, I know that we have sincere, thoughtful, kind educators who want to do what's best for kids. And despite what educators have been attempting to do to help kids to read, even I could have, when I got to the middle school, I just knew every kid that I worked with, that my teachers worked with at Star, they were going to be on track and ready to read because I saw what we did with them. And I saw what we did for them. And they got there and I'm like, oh my gosh, what happened, right? So relative to those pieces of understanding, we are finding that people are willing and able to move along with us, and that they are so moved and so thoughtful about implementing strong literacy practices that will work, that right now we feel like we are impacting a lot of people. I think that Dr. Jenner's mention of MTSS was also critical because that's also part of what we've placed here, which will ask educators across the state to be very thoughtful about the data that's in front of them and to pinpoint best practices along with phonemic awareness and some other things that their framework definitely targets.
As we were really leaning in to this push, we reviewed the research a lot more than what we showed today, but right, review the research, we've got to go this direction. There was some discussion about, is this an opt-in or is it mandatory? And by the way, we had some legislators who were ready to make it, write a piece of legislation to make it mandatory. What we asked as a department, as a team, is let's try to empower, put good information out there to our schools. Let's use the carrot approach on this to see what might be possible if, again, we put the data out there, we make phone calls, which Carrie and team have called a lot of superintendents and principals directly to say, hey, check out your data. Because the key is, and you've been a school leader, we've all been school leaders in different ways at this table. If the school leader, which includes teachers, are on board, it is go for launch. Like, things are gonna happen. But if the state does a mandate and you're not on board, you're not feeling it, it doesn't sometimes even get off the runway. So it was key for us to launch this in a way that is just like, hey, here's the honest data and information. We want to help and support. If you're in, we're in, let's do it. And that's where Carrie and team have done an incredible job, because we've had enormous amount of support leaning in. To your other point, Scott, which I think is a good one, what about the schools that are, they have decent pass percentage rate, but they have some students who are not, and I'll share very, very personally, my own two kids, twins, daughters, 6th grade now. They both can read now, but let me tell you, in 3rd grade, I didn't know if one of them was gonna pass, because I had one who was a reader who just got it, and then the other one needed extra support. Welcome to all students in Indiana. That's how this works. Every child's a different learner. And so I vividly remember one of the school interventionists working with her on, whether it was M-Class or Dibbles, where she had, working with her specifically on the phonics and phonemic awareness skills. And I ran into her this weekend, and I still look at Miss Kimmel and say, Miss Kimmel, you taught her how to read, and she knows that. But right, that if we have students, regardless if you're a high-performing school, that don't know how to read, and we've always been teaching them through, let's say, whole language, right? some get it that way. But this other group of students maybe need some different strategies. And that's where working with our educator pipeline and the resources, making sure that our educators have that support and resource available is going to be really, really important. Now, once we see this data, we'll work with our various stakeholder groups and say, what have we learned from this data? What do we know? And do we need to go, a different route down the road? Again, you always look at data and then you make informed decisions. So, but that's where we were this year, that's where we are currently, and we've been very pleased with how many schools have leaned in.
Absolutely, it's been amazing.
Can I add something to what Dr. Jenner just stated on a personal note as well? So I have a son who, he's 20 now, he's in college, but also in the 3rd grade. He kind of struggled. And for him, the struggle, honestly, was not the ability to read, it was the interest
The passion.
in what it was he was reading. And so what his mom and I had to do, we had to find things that were passionate to him. So, and I don't know how that plays a role in this or any of that, but just a thought. How
Yeah.
do we get to the passion of the students and what it is that they are interested in that would encourage them to actually to read?
And that really is a hallmark of what the science of reading, and almost as importantly, how we re-engage teachers' passions in teaching reading too, right? I mean, and it's kind of interesting because one of the proposed opportunities that we're going to have in Learning Lab over the summer is engaging boys, in particular, in the act of reading, and how that is so very different. And a dear colleague, Dr. Schaefer, wrote a book specific to engaging young men. So that what you mentioned is a very typical trajectory, and one that we'll address through our professional development too. It's awesome.
So we have a question
Yeah.
online
Of
from our
course.
Teams group. BJ Watts, I think you have a question?
Yes, absolutely. We talked about our partners in higher ed and the science framework. I think, and don't quote me on this, but I think that this is already in policy that it is required that be taught in teacher prep programs. Do we know if that's the case?
I'm looking at our general counsel, Chad. Yeah, BJ, we'll have to pull that information. I think if it's in policy, and again, we'll look, but if it's in policy, the one thing we have to contemplate is which part of the educator pipeline is being targeted in the teacher prep program? Is it your early learning to grade 3 teachers? That would make sense. But what we're seeing and what we've heard from teachers on repeat is, what about the 8th grader who can't read? And if I wasn't taught as an 8th grade teacher to teach reading or some of the strategies, I need a little help too. So I think the question that we are unpacking is, at what level is each of our educator prep programs teaching the science of reading, and how does that look? So thanks for bringing that question up, BJ. Do you have any follow-up?
Well, I think that as we, like when I look at it, it is, and you and I have talked a bunch about this, and K3 is obviously, when you ask what my number one thing for the dashboard was, this K2 literacy is number one for me. Because like many of you, I have that personal story where I have two sons. One of them, this was not a concern for, one of them it truly was. So we spent we had tutors 2 nights a week and all those things, but I understand that there are folks that don't have the resources to do that. So ensuring that we have this in place, and the fact that, and again, I'm pointing the finger at myself here, we don't know if this is in policy, so we're not really checking it. I think speaks to the fact that I love that you've brought this to the forefront and understanding how important it is, because I truly do believe that in K through 2, there's nothing more important than literacy, because if we get that part down, everything else becomes easier. So I love that this is at the forefront, and I think that our partnerships with our higher ed institutions need to, as far as licensing goes, that is a place where we can truly make widespread change here.
Yeah, thank you, BJ. And one thing that you mentioned is varying level of parent resources to support their child. And
Absolutely.
I think that's really important to mention because one of the bills that passed, and I think it was in the wee hours of the night, I think, was for the Department of Ed with our federal dollars to deploy a micro grant for parents who are who have students who, are most at risk in terms of financial, but also their academic data, and deploy that micro grant specifically for enrichment for children. Again, the educators, we're gonna do everything we can for that child. Parents, we want parents to come alongside and be a part of that solution. So those that can already do, and those that may need some additional support, we will have this micro grant for enrichment available. More to come on that. But I wanted to mention that, BJ, because I think that's a great point. And that passed.
All right.
What else for Carrie?
I've got a quick question just
Yes.
about the coaching recruitment.
Yeah.
So when you find these coaches, are you taking them out of the classroom? And they're full-time coaches?
It was really critical as we were processing and thinking about this plan that we were sensitive to the needs of every district. So when you say find, districts are providing and then offering a coach that would maximize their capacity and their potential. For our targeted schools, we are then going through the process of interviewing and vetting those candidates to ensure consistency across the program. But we were very, very sensitive to thinking about how schools could adapt and how they might be able to think about whom they would like to select and how they would like to select them. And the other thing that I would offer, and I can't speak for every school in Indiana, but I would offer, especially in that K-2 space, that a lot of our schools have coaches. They've already used or use coaching models that might allow for them to use people that are already in a place, in addition to maybe selecting some others to support student needs.
All right, thank you. Lynn, you want to come on up and share your part of the information?
Absolutely. Good morning. Lynn Schemmel, Director of Student Assessment. So I think my presentation ties right in with some of the conversation that's been taking place today. So to close out the presentation on early literacy, I'd like to share information about using iRead3 as an early indicator for students who need additional reading support. Carrie shared data around iRead3 results and the importance of support for those students who do not pass. Of those students who do not pass, about half of them receive good cause exemptions. Those good cause exemptions are granted to students after an iRead3 administration and exempt eligible students from additional iRead3 testing. English learners, students with disability, and students who have already been retained twice are eligible, and it's based on a case conference committee's decision after reviewing those iRead3 results. In collaboration with the literacy initiatives of the Office of Teaching and Learning to provide reading instruction support to students in a more prompt manner, the Office of Student Assessment offered schools the option to administer iRead3 to grade 2 students this administration this spring of 2022. We are pleased and excited that nearly 400 schools opted in for this opportunity.
So that's 40% of elementary schools opted in.
Yeah. So some reasons and benefits behind offering this early opportunity. While schools may have other means of gathering literacy data, as Carrie shared, we have many years of iRead3 data and the corresponding data points for students who do not pass. By offering iRead3 for grade 2 students, students in need can receive earlier targeted instruction and support. Supporting students earlier can lead to higher rates of reading success at grade 3 and beyond, and may reduce the need to provide those good cause exemptions. Students who pass iRead3 in grade 2 are exempt from participating at grade 3, thus reducing their grade 3 testing time. and allows for that targeted support to those students who will participate in the retest. So how did we get here? The Office of Student Assessment, with guidance from Indiana's Technical Advisory Committee, analyzed the current iRead 3 assessment and the iRead 3 test blueprints to ensure that it would be appropriate to serve this new purpose. Our process was twofold. First, we performed a standards comparison between the standards assessed on iRead 3 and the Indiana academic standards at grade 2. Secondly, we performed a test item analysis to grade 2 academic standards compared with the items that are tested on iRead 3. Based on the results, we, along with the Technical Advisory Committee, concluded that the current assessment is indeed appropriate for grade 2 administration. Next, we considered what would be required to provide schools with information about a student's reading ability at grade 2. The current grade 3 cut score may not be appropriate for showing if students are on track for that reading proficiency at grade 2, so a new additional cut score will be set on the current scale to identify if students are on track for reading proficiency at grade 2. Annually then, second grade students will be able to participate as schools opt in. They will receive individual student reports with 3 performance levels: pass, on track, or did not pass. Those students who achieve the grade 3 passing level will be exempt from any future grade 3 assessment. They've completed that requirement. Students who are on track in second grade for that reading proficiency are not required to receive any specific any additional reading instruction. They may, but then they also will participate again as a third grade student. And then the students who do not pass in grade 2 will be required to receive dedicated reading support, and then they will also retest in grade 3. Good cause exemptions remain as they are. Those will not be provided to students until after a grade 3 administration. So that way students and educators and parents can assess the impact of the interventions and the support that was provided for the students' learning and on their growth. To determine the on-track score, a representative sample of schools was determined by our testing vendor. This student data will be used this summer to determine the on-track cut score to be confirmed by educator and policy committees. As I mentioned earlier, not only did schools in this sample opt in, but also another 350 schools opted in to begin testing this week. The grade 2 administration is identical to the grade 3 administration. Schools will get initial student reports for these students, and then after the policy and the educator committees convene in June, we'll present the outcomes to you, and then we'll notify schools in July of what the on-track cut score is.
And I want to hit on that, going back to your earlier policy question, Scott. So you see what our goal was in order to run this pilot, 30 to 35 schools. 400 opted in. Totally incredible. So I just wanted to point that out, going back to that question you had earlier. Okay, Lynn?
Sure. So moving forward then, in the spring of 2023, students in grade 2 will receive results with all 3 of those performance levels identified on their individual student reports after the test administration, along with the grade 3 students. The good cause exemption, again, remains as is and will be granted after a third grade administration to those students who are eligible. Our opt-in flyer with many of the points that I've discussed is attached to this presentation, as well as there's other information with, about the policy and frequently asked questions on our IDOE assessment page. So we look forward to providing educators, students, and families with literacy proficiency information and data to inform instruction. We appreciate the opportunity to present our updates to you today.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Are there any questions for Lynn?
Can I ask one?
Yes.
So, one, I really like that. You know that, right?
Yep.
And Sherry and I have had conversations back when, right? When we talked about grade 2 using this as that. But then one of the comments that got made earlier that I loved was, hey, we've done a great job at elementary and reading, and then we got to middle school and it's like, oh my gosh, they weren't what we thought, right? What was the comment? Do we, and this has been one of the things that I've asked a few times on this, So if we have a student that passes I read 3 in the 2nd grade or passes in the 3rd grade, does that mean that that student's going to be able to read in middle school?
Do you want me to answer, or do you want Carrie to? So, Indiana Academic Standards, reading standards continue on. The iRead 3 is about those foundational reading skills. So those early skills that are important, they still need to be built upon. So there's still additional instruction that needs to take place and additional interventions and support as needed.
Okay, that's what I thought, but I wanted to make sure that I was okay on that. So what's the plan then, or is there yet? And I realize we're early. Some of the stuff we're just now getting done, right? So I appreciate that fact. Is there a plan past 3rd grade so we don't get to that? Because that's always been my thing, right? We always tout this 85% passing, and then we get into the higher grades and we start looking at data and they're like, well, man, we only got 30% that can read or whatever. And it's like, okay, what happened there, right? Again, that story that we need to tell. Can we talk a little bit about because Charity's nodding her head real big, which I'm excited about.
Yeah, so Dr. Flores, why don't you come on up?
And if that's not appropriate at this point, but I think it's
totally appropriate.
What's
yeah,
the next
let's talk about it.
piece, right?
So with the academic impact, we have our short-term tactics that we're implementing, which are what Carrie and Lynn spoke about today. As soon as we're lifting off kind of this first phase of work, what Carrie's team is already talking about is how do we also provide support for grades beyond 2. So we know that some of those foundational skills with science of reading also need to be articulated and provided a level of assistance for teachers beyond grade 2, because some of our students are moving into those grades subsequently where they may not be successful. And so that's the next phase of our work. So we wanted to lift off this targeted effort in grades K-2 first, but that is really something that her team is defining as we move into the summer and into the fall so that we can provide broader support as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Carrie, I appreciated you saying the way you did. Hey, we know they can read, and we know that we've done all this work, and then all of a sudden we get there, and that's always been the story. And now I like the fact that we're really, really talking about that, calling that out, and what the next piece is going to be. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Yes, Scott.
So I'm going to put in, again, I think Charity, this may be for you, because I think I know you're doing work in this realm, and I think, because I'm going back to the current STEM data points, right? So now I am in my wheelhouse of STEM and talking more high school. Again, talking about the number of jobs that are growing. Less than a third were STEM degrees out of the 60,000. Only 35% proficient on ISTEP. 28% of STEM degrees awarded to female students. 5% awarded to Hispanic students. And again, I also think if you look at low-income students, if you disaggregated that across the state, you'd see a really tiny number. So. Dr. Jenner knows, I shared something with her back in the fall, right? And so something that really impacted me this year, again, I'm not a huge social media person, particularly Facebook and stuff like that. Twitter, yes, others no. But there was a post by a relatively young teacher at a high-end suburban high school with all the amenities, right? Terrazzo floors everywhere, vaulted hallway ceilings, 14 gyms and 3 pools. And
14 gyms in Indiana?
Pretty close.
Oh, my.
Right, so all this stuff, right? High paid. And she's a science teacher, right, with a degree from a prestigious university. So all the things that are like right there. But her post, and I won't necessarily read all of it, and this is in response to somebody else's post about struggles teachers were having with burnout and all those kinds of things. And she said, for me, it's the balance of pushing content after content after content without ever truly feeling satisfied with the amount of time and guidance I would like to teach kids without the burden of content overload looming over me. I'd love to have more time discussing effective reading strategies, writing lab reports, discussing math number sense, exploratory lab time, truly digesting real-world articles and news context of new science I want to do, but there's always something that would get cut out. I want kids to have the time and opportunities to make mistakes and learn from them while I'm there to coach them through it. But often it feels like we need to learn this now and move on in my lesson plans. And if I feel that way, imagine how my students feel, right? And so, and this may just be teeing up some, maybe this is kind of like Dr. Ernest's last meeting, Ask a Question was led to this presentation today. I think I'm asking a question I don't necessarily need, we don't want to need to discuss today and go into something, but I think it's heavy on my mind that, you know, certainly when we talk about teacher burnout and retention, and everybody almost automatically goes to teacher pay, and that's critically important, and we need to focus on that. But I would argue that if there's a teacher who has all of the positives, like everything going for her, and she feels that way, how long will she last? Because she has options. I know what her degree is in. She could go do anything else. And how long will she be satisfied doing that? And I think, you know, I know the work Dr. Flores is doing and the department generally with looking at our standards. Obviously, some of the late night legislation that came through, there's some directives there. I'd love to have at a future meeting, initial thoughts, but then also at a future meeting, some more in-depth discussion about what does that path look like? Is how do we fix that? Because offering students more opportunities to do more of the same probably isn't going to lead to a ton of different results. And so I'd love to get the thinking of the department and other experts in how do we change that while we're dealing with some of the legislation and some of the work that you're doing. So initial thoughts, and then love to tee it up for later if it's possible.
Yeah, this is an incredibly exciting time, I think, in working with our team. So Lynn and Carrie's team, they are really spearheading some bold and innovative work for the department. I think historically the department has contemplated but never fully delivered what we may define to be as essential standards. And so we're at a place now in light of our assessment where we have standards level information and can offer some insight, at least at the state level, of where we're seeing some patterns or maybe some issues related to performance. And so last Friday, we released a memo from Carrie and Lynn that highlighted how we're going to approach some of that work in defining essential standards. And so the first iteration of that is going to be delivered in late April. We wanted to make sure that the iLearn window was underway because we didn't want that to be convoluted in light of the upcoming assessment. But we had the opportunity with our team to dig into our summative data, our formative and interim data. We actually had an educator committee meeting last week, and it was so great to hear some of our thoughts confirmed by what they're seeing in classrooms with their students. And so we're going to take this on as an iterative approach over the next couple of years. And then there also was some directive that will be informing our work as well. But again, I think this is a very exciting time to really balance what some of those critical or essential standards need to be in terms of areas of focus. And we're excited to deploy that next month.
Thank you.
Thank you. Scott, great question. Something that is on all of our minds. Nationwide, how do we keep our great teachers in our educator pipeline? How do we recruit the best and the brightest to join us? So in addition to Dr. Flores and the academic team, you know, this is a conversation that, it's one of our pillars. This is a conversation that every single division of our department is focused on. And Dr. Rebecca Estes, who's our senior director of the educator pipeline, I think that might open an opportunity to have her come in the future. It might be a complementary presentation across divisions, similar to what we saw today, but just to further peel that back. You know, this challenge, let's be real, this challenge didn't start overnight. It didn't start within the past 5 years. And this has been building. This is nationwide, one of the top discussions, and we have to acknowledge it, and bigger than that, we have to seek to solve and put solutions towards that. So I appreciate you asking the question, and it's a good point. Anything else for Dr. Flores, Carrie, Lynn?
I do have just one clarifying question. I don't want to belabor the point, but just a clarifying question on the good cause exemption. Did I hear correctly that that determination is made in the case conference? Did I hear that
The
correctly?
case conference committee, yes, makes that decision.
So my follow-up question to that is, what if the student is not sped? Because typically those case conferences come because a student is sped, but what if a student isn't
Right, so
sped?
students who aren't eligible for a good cause exemption continue to retake the assessment. So there's a spring and summer administration in grade 3, and then same thing in grade 4 and grade 5. if
So
the
that's a,
student doesn't
that's a
pass.
good question that we've received quite a bit at the department. So let's just clarify that here and now for anyone who is tuning in. Good cause exemption is only eligible for what students?
You want to take it? Go ahead.
Sure. Eligible for special education students, so students with disabilities, English learners, and students who have been retained twice.
So any student who does not receive a good cause exemption, who does not pass the I-Read 3, the school has a couple of options. They can choose to, in working with the parent, keep that child in 3rd grade, or they may promote that child to 4th grade. And if they choose to promote that child to 4th grade, what is required then?
They need to continue to provide 3rd grade reading instruction,
3rd grade reading instruction,
and then the student will retest.
and the student is required to retest. So some of the longitudinal data that we did not show you today, I think it's captured in the 50, 60-page reading report that the academic team did in the past couple months. But the longitudinal data there shows that many of the students who are retesting pass with that extra intervention and remediation. So again, good question, but that's been a common, frequently asked question that we've received for sure, and how that law works, how the implementation works. Any other questions? Okay, seeing none, I did get text messages from people who are tuning in. So there are more than just 12 people watching this today. And one of the people who sent me a text, Jason Callahan, Assistant Secretary of Pathways and Opportunities, said, point of clarification, that 16,712 that I mentioned earlier who are eligible for crossing the finish line because they're this close to earning a credential, that's from Ivy Tech alone. So we will still get Vincennes numbers, right? So I just wanted to make that clarification. The opportunity to sign up for that just opened. Already 491 students are signed up already. So wanted to add that point of clarification. On that note, do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved. Aye.
Motion second, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you.